I'd like to welcome you to the Fine Arts Zoom presentation of Game Changers, Choreographers Who Changed the Face of Dance. And a big thank you to Matt for presenting today. Hi, Matt, thank you. And Matt has presented for us many times before, and we're happy that he's willing to teach in this new way. He's probably more experienced than we all are, but continues to encourage lifelong learning by teaching us how to Zoom. So maybe we can be boomer Zoomers. And if you read Matt's information in his biography, you realize what an expert he is in many, many different areas because he teaches so many different classes. And last year, he was awarded the Dorothy Wiley DeLong Endowed Scholarship, recognizing his value to the college. So please help me welcome Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Hey, thanks everybody. So welcome, thanks for having me back. I was saying to Marty that HASP classes are always my favorite to teach because unlike the 19 through 21-year-olds who I teach sometimes, you all actually have questions and you have good questions. So I really, I'm so thankful to be back and for 2 sessions, so this Monday and next Monday. If you are struggling to find the chat option, or if you haven't seen it, like I said, if you, like Kim said, if you scroll down, if you're on a computer, again, iPad I don't know much about because I don't use my iPad for Zoom, but if you click that little, it looks like a cartoon wind bubble and it says chat, that will then open up the chat side. So you actually have a white bar on the right side of your screen. But you're welcome to use that if you want. I was telling Kim before though, when I work with my students, when I present, I actually, the Zoom screen gets shrunk on my side. And so I actually can't see the chat and I actually can only see like 3 people. So if during the presentation, if you guys have any questions, I would say don't hesitate. What I tell my students is to just say, hey, Matt, which makes me stop talking. And then you can say your name. This is, you know, somebody, Marty Everett, and I'll say, oh, Marty, yeah, and then you can say, here's my question. And the thing is that when I teach in person, I really like to think of lectures as a conversation and less of me lecturing. So I've tried to adapt that to online to say that, you know, I want this to be more of a conversation than it is just me spilling out and spewing out information. So again, at any point along the conversation, if you have a question or even a comment, you can just again say, hey, Matt, like I said, that's my cue to stop talking and then say, this is so-and-so, whatever your name is, and then ask your question. I will take, at the end of each choreographer, I will switch off the presentation mode and come back to the full Zoom mode so that way I can see your lovely faces. And I can also answer questions at that point as well. So yeah, so I think with that, the other thing I'll say before we get started, so if it's okay with you, I realized the original list that I sent to Marty had a few choreographers missing that I would like to incorporate. So I'm actually gonna, just for an added bonus, add a couple more choreographers both to today's lecture and next Monday's lecture. So, and then I do have some videos that are interlinked into the PowerPoint presentation. We probably won't watch every video all the way through just because some of them are 3 minutes and some of them are 20 minutes, but you know, we'll watch enough to kind of get a flavor of the choreographers and the styles that I'll be talking about. So with that, do we have any questions before I begin? All right. So I'm going to share my screen then, and we're going to jump over right now. And Marty, I can see your face, so I'm just going to ask Marty, can you see my presentation? It says Game Changers, Choreographers. Great, perfect. So like I said, the title of this is Game Changers, Choreographers Who Changed the Face of Dance in America. When I get to the end of today's session, I will talk about one other choreographer who I'm not presenting about, but she is famous enough that I felt like most people recognize how she changed the face of dance in America. So I tried to pick some people who I think a lot of audience members know. And I tried to pick people who I think also people don't recognize. They might know who they are, but they don't recognize the impact they made on dance in the United States. So the first one we're going to start off with is a pretty obvious one. Actually, oh, sorry, let me pause here real quick. Let me stop sharing. I'm going to actually reshare from this screen instead. Here we go. And let me start this over again from current slide. There we go. And now I'm up and running. So the first one most people know is a gentleman named George Balanchine. And George, if you know anything about the ballet world, this name should sound familiar. George Balanchine was the sole choreographer for the New York City Ballet. I'm going to jump back so you guys can see his face here while I talk a little bit, for over half a decade. A little known fact, so a gentleman named Lincoln Kirsten originally founded the New York City Ballet, and he wanted to model it after Sergei Diaghilev's The Ballet Russe. So Lincoln Kirsten was such a fan of Sergei Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe that he said, I want to do what they're doing and bring it to the United States. Little side and fun note, how he took sort of it as a providential sign that he should do this, that he was in Europe one time wandering around and there was a morning procession. And so he decided just to join it, I guess, because that's what we do, and followed the procession to the cathedral. And lo and behold, it was Sergei Diaghilev's funeral that he ended up attending. And so Lincoln Kirsten took that as a sign that you know, it's meant to be. So long story short, he recruits George Balanchine to come to the United States after many conversations, and then set up a ballet company. And like I said, originally it was meant to be modeled after the Ballet Russe, which is what's called a repertory ballet company, which means multiple choreographers come through and choreograph, and that's what the Ballet Russe was. The Ballet Russe had sort of in-house choreographers, but a lot of choreographers were choreographing major works, you know, such as Vasyl Nijinsky's Rite of Spring, Michael Folkein's Firebird. And so it's first called Ballet Caravan is the company, and then it's called American Ballet Presents, and it goes through all these name changes. And the reason for that being is that following World War I, and of course leading into World War II, there was kind of an anti-European sentiment. And so anything that sort of lended or leaned towards a European style, a lot of Americans were not in favor of. And so it's at that point that Balanchine and Kirsten decide, you know what, let's make a shift here. Rather than try and do repertory works, right, that were famous in Europe, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make George Balanchine the sole choreographer, and we're going to create a whole brand new technique in ballet that George Balanchine is going to create, and that's going to become the new American ballet standard. And by golly, that's what they did. So George Balanchine ends up developing, and I'm going to see if I can admit this person. There we go. Ends up developing something called the neoclassical technique, or some people just call it the Balanchine technique. Word neoclassical comes, any music lovers in there, of course, you know, in the music world and the dance world follows the same structure, right? So you have the Baroque period, then you have the Romantic period, then you have the classical period of ballet or music, and then into neoclassical. And neo is Latin for new, so it just means new classical, really. And oh yeah, is there?
It's the controls are down in here, but they're covered up now because you moved it higher than I had it set.
I think I got you. There we go. Perfect. So anyways, so he starts what's called the neoclassical, and of course the Ballet Russe and Sergei Diaghilev really are responsible for, at least in the ballet terms in the dance world, known for ushering in the classical period of ballet. And so Balanchine ushers in the neoclassical period. Neoclassicism, then, the question is, what is that? What does a neoclassical or the Balanchine technique look like? Well, number one is that Balanchine started to get away from the classic, what we call lines of ballet, right? So straight legs, pointed feet, long extended arms. He did have those things, but he would also have his dancers flex their feet, right? He would have them bend their arms. He would have them bend their torso and shift it and sort of manipulate a little bit. And that really started to change the look of ballet at the point. He would also have, right up until this point, you know, you would have in classical ballet specifically, right? You always had the lead danseur, the male, and then the prima, the lead prima. And at the end of it, they would always have some sort of, at the end of any classical ballet that you watch, right, there's the grand pas de deux, we call the grand pas, right? So you have the male dancer does his solo, the female dancer does her solo, and then they do a grand pas or a grand pas de deux, which is two people dancing. Balanchine says, you know what? Why can't a male partner with two women or three women, as he does in one of his most famous pieces, Apollo? Another thing about neoclassicism is that it's usually plotless, which again is drastically different, right, from any of the, the Baroque period of ballet is very much the original Louis XIV. We think of the court dances, things like that. You get into then the Romantic period, that's where we get some of our lovely Swan Lake, La Saphir, right? And we call them the fairy tale ballets, right? But there's a story to them. Same thing with the classical period, right? Classical period is we call the Great Russian, right? Same with music, the Great Russian Rise. So you have Tchaikovsky and you have Prokofiev, right? And you have Stravinsky writing these great orchestral scores for these ballets that have a storyline. Well, Balanchine, when he decides to sort of create this new technique for what we would call American ballet, starts to create plotless ballets. And so that really changes the face of the ballet world and sort of opens up the door for then later in the 20th century and early 21st century, which we would call now contemporary ballet. You also have what we call brilliant leg and footwork. So in ballet, there's a term called petit allegro, and it's this very fast footwork that happens both at the bar and at center. Balanchine was a huge fan of that, right? And so he would ever increasing both the tempo and the amount of petit allegro put into ballets versus previously in the classical period and particularly in the Romantic period, things were much more position based, in terms of making very pretty pictures on stage, things like that. Like I said, that next bullet point focuses more on the line and composition than a story or dramatic characters. The word composition is a new term also for ballet at that point, because up until that point, you created the steps based on what the storyline required, where Balanchine started to focus on what in dance we call the composition or the choreography of the dance. And so to start looking at things like motif, arc, theme and variation. Again, if there's any music lovers out there, these should all sound very familiar because these are all musical terms as well. A couple quotes from from Balanchine then, when he first started down this road, people were not so sure. The New York Times was a little skeptical of it, and they started asking him questions. And so one of the questions they asked, a reporter asked, they said, well, how are you coming up with this thing? And so he said, music is the floor for dancing, right? That was his base premise. And then another reviewer asked him one time, well, why don't you, Mr. Balanchine, why don't you do the classics? Why don't you do the Nutcracker? Which he actually did. The New York City Nutcracker is probably one of the famous in the United States, outside of Ruth Page's Nutcracker, which was performed in Chicago for a long time. Anyways, but why don't you do these old classics that people remember? And his response to this person was, well, why should we do Shakespeare? Shakespeare has already done Shakespeare quite well, and so he's not saying you shouldn't do Shakespeare, but he's saying, I'm not going to write another Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare did it really well. So let's try something new. So really through neoclassical technique, Balanchine would change the ballet world forever. City Ballet really became sort of the standard ballet company in the United States, along with a couple others, ABT, which is American Ballet Theater, Pacific Northwest, San Francisco Ballet, and then Miami City Ballet. And each of those had their own kind of like niche in the ballet world, but Balanchine would really set the standard. He would also set the standard because being a sole choreographer, most ballet companies today are, again, what we call repertory companies. They have multiple choreographers, or if they even have an artistic director, she or he might choreograph one ballet, but there's usually 6 other choreographers that they hire. Balanchine, as long as he was able to, was the sole choreographer for New York City Ballet, and like I said, for almost half a decade, which is a pretty long run. Another way that Balanchine changed the face of dance in America and globally, I would argue, is the body type of ballet dancers. So in this slide, you see I have two sort of dancers, right? So you have pre-1950, so Marie Taglioni, who was way before 1950. Marie Taglioni was famous in like the early 1900s as a prima ballerina. That being said, the body type pre-1950 for the ideal ballet dancer was Marie Taglioni. She was about, I think she was like 5'5". You know, she was pretty short. You know, they usually had slightly bigger thighs as a way to be able to get up on point. They were very light-skinned, and then as far as extension, you know, now we think of ballet dancers with these super high legs and stuff, and that was not important. Balanchine's not necessarily credited fully with the extension. That's through a couple other dancers who kind of started to push the edge, but Balanchine was influenced by them. Fast forward, you have, this is a picture of Gelsey Kirkland, which is one of Balanchine's most famous ballet dancers. And the dancer, you guys can see, not only gets taller, it's kind of hard to see in these pictures, but the ideal ballet dancer gets slightly taller, gets tremendously thinner, and particularly in the arms and the collarbones. And so Balanchine would say to many of his dancers, I want to see your collarbones, I want to see your collarbones, and I want to see your rib cage. That, of course, had an both a positive and negative effect by the long limbs. Now we get the beautiful extensions that we see in ballet. Of course, the downside of it is that it led to sort of more the eating disorders that you see in ballet today. There's 2 theories behind why Balanchine favored this look. Balanchine grew up in Russia just post the revolution. And so he attended a dance school, like many young men of his day. But because of the poverty in Russia, most of the young children at the time were more malnourished. And so some historians think that Balanchine favored that look because it was reminiscent of sort of, or implanted in his brain as a young child. Other historians say yes, but perhaps more so that look really became popular for Balanchine during like the late 60s, early 70s. And a lot of people will reference fashion. And so you all probably remember Twiggy, one of the big fashion models of that era. And so a lot of historians think that it was more the fashion of the era that started to feed Balanchine's look than his history as a child. Personally, as a historian, I think it's a little bit of both for me. But that would be, the body type. Really, Balanchine set the standard for the body type, and it really did not change up until, I'm going to say, about 2009. So that ideal body type lasted, and so about 2009, 2010, when we see the body type change, not just in ballet but in dance in general, to what we now call athletic in dance, right? The athletic dancer look. And so dancers who opened the door for that, obviously Misty Copeland would be one, right? She's got much more muscle on her body. There's a few other dancers. Her name's escaping me right now, but she was a prima for the Houston Ballet Company. They were still thin, but they had muscle. And so you couldn't see their collarbones or you couldn't see their rib cage, things like that. So again, that's a pretty long stretch to affect the ballet world. Some other things just to think about for Balanchine, considered as a master choreographer, is that like I said, actually his entire ballet career spanned 4 decades. So I apologize, I said half a decade, I meant half a century. He was a choreographer first for the Ballet Russe, so hence the reason Lincoln Kirsten recruited him, because originally they wanted to make City Ballet like the Ballet Russe. He has 2 famous ballets. So he choreographed 4 total ballets for the Ballet Russe when he was a choreographer, or 10. Only 2 of them exist though, because of course cameras weren't, or, you know, video wasn't around the time. So Apollo and Prodigal Son are the 2 ballets that still exist from, and you can still see today in repertory in certain ballet companies. That being said, over his 4 decades as a choreographer, he choreographed more than 425 works. And this does not include, this is just ballet works. So this doesn't include, few people know he also choreographed for Broadway and film as well. So certainly you could say total choreography over his 4 decades, he was probably pushing somewhere of like 450, 460, you know, choreographic works. But like the 425 is just his ballets. Like I said, while he was at Ballet Russe, he created 10 total, but 2 of which, Apollo, which is a pretty famous one. If anybody's seen City Ballet, that's kind of one of their standards. And then some of his other most famous works, Allegro Brillante, Aegon, Jewels, which I have a small clip from. So we're going to watch a small clip from the section called Rubies. And then, like I said, the Nutcracker that he created for New York City Ballet. A little relevant to today's conversation while we're having it. New York City Ballet sadly announced that the Nutcracker this year will not be happening. So it's the first time, I can't remember, I just read in the New York Times, it's the first time in, I don't know, like 87 years or something that City Ballet has not done, you know, their annual Nutcracker. So, so with that, we're gonna go down and watch just a little section here. So this is the pas de deux, which means dance for 2 in French. This is from the section called Rubies. So obviously Jewels, the ballet, is all based on different jewels. So there's emeralds, sapphire, rubies, diamond. And again, just in classic Balanchine format, there's no plot. Right? It's sort of what we call dance for dance sake, right? Enjoying the music and the movement. So we'll watch a little bit of this. So I'm going to stop sharing here real quick so I can answer questions that anybody may have. I chose that clip for 2 reasons. Number 1, obviously the dancing is brilliant. And number 2, that little clip incorporates all of the neoclassical items I was talking about. So you could see how they kind of like, there's the part where they thrust their hips forward. You would never see that in classical ballet or romantic ballet. You could see certain points where the female flexed her foot. You'd never see that, right, in classical or romantic ballet. You could see the men, you know, there was a part where they both stopped and bent their arms. right? Again, breaking what we would call the line. You'd never see that in classical or romantic ballet. And then you could also see the composition of the piece. So again, not that there was no storyline. It wasn't about, you know, the male and the female falling in love or breaking up or anything like that, but it was about two dancers, right, using their bodies to emphasize the musicality. So questions about George Balanchine or any comments? All right. Well, then I'll keep forging ahead. Let me share my screen again here. And
I have a question.
yes.
What did they give a reason why they are not doing the Nutcracker? Was there any?
Yeah, it has to do with COVID. So
Okay.
a lot of companies have already announced canceling their fall season, and of course, fall season carries into the first of the year, so that includes their Nutcracker. And they're just, a lot of companies are unsure what you know, what the fall is going to look like, and it costs so much to put a production on, not just to pay the dancers for rehearsals and to pay the you know, and to pay the set people to build the sets, and, you know, the costumers to clean the costumes and all this kind of stuff. And then on top of that, the question is, you know, a lot of companies, you know, those ticket sales, they kind of average, they say, oh, okay, you know, if we make 80% of the house, then we're going to be okay. If we make anything less than 40% of the house, the total seats in the house, then we're gonna, you know, it's not going to be a moneymaker for us. And so, you know, with the not knowing what kind of the fall is going to look like, and if you have to social distance, I mean, if you think of it this way, the Knickerbocker Theater seats about 422 seats. And let's say a theater said, you know, let's say they said, okay, we're going to do live performances, but you have to create one seat in all directions between each, right? So now you've cut, for easy math, for my easy math, right? Let's just say 400. So you've taken your house of 400 down to 1/4. So now you only have 100 seats, right, that are actually available for ticket sales. Well, if, you know, let's say you're selling tickets at $20 a ticket, you know, suddenly now that's drastically less money you make. And so I think a lot of the companies have said it's just easier not knowing what audiences are going to be able to do, to just cancel their fall season. Some people, us included in the dance department, are coming up with some interesting solutions as sort of preparatory to say, okay, we want to do live performances. First question is, you know, what will be the rules of having performances in a closed venue? Number two, if we do our performances early enough in the year, can we do them outdoor? Because the outdoor, you know, I think right now the regulation is you can have gatherings up to 250 outdoor. You know, so we're looking at saying, okay, what are some possible venues outdoor, you know, that we could do a performance at? And then we're also in the dance department looking, if we say, if we can't do outdoor performances that are live, can we do what's called dance for camera films, right? So can you, so there's two options. You can either still perform on stage and just live stream, right? So essentially the dancers perform without an audience, but the audience is watching on their computer. Or do you actually create a film? And there's a whole sector of the dance world called dance for camera, where it is actual movies anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour and a half. That, you know, that are dances, and, you know, they can get as complicated or simple as, you know, just kind of a video camera on a tripod, to having whole camera crews. You know, you think of a film, a Hollywood film you watch, I mean, there's, you know, close-ups and jump shots and all these kind of cool things. So there's some companies, including the dance department, who are trying to find alternative possibilities if, you know, what we call in space or closed venues are not available.
And how do you get your income from that too? Would be a question.
A question, right? Yeah, I mean, as the dance department, we have a little bit of cushion room because, of course, we're part of Hope College. But yeah, any organization, and that's the other hard part too, is a lot of dance companies in the country, actually, what they don't make their annual budget off of ticket sales. Really, their ticket sales are just kind of on top. Where they make their money are their schools. So Balanchine, for example, New York City Ballet has the School of American Ballet tied to it, right? And so that's tuition money that students pay to go to that school, hopefully to work their way up and become a part of the ballet company. Joffrey Ballet does the same, all these. The problem right now, to your point, is if you can't hold classes, that means you can't charge tuition. so now you're doubly, you know, in the red, you know. And so I think that's why I think a lot of the, not just ballet companies, I think you're going to see a lot of dance companies who will probably try to get their schools up and running again, so that way they can make that tuition money. And then what they might do is do a subscription series. So I don't know if you guys have ever gone to the Holland 7, but the Holland 7 has, at least used to, once a month, live stream of the Metropolitan Opera.
Yeah.
And so the Holland 7 in that case pays a subscription, and then they charge you the ticket price to go to the Holland 7. I can see or foresee a lot of dance companies doing something like that, where rather, you know, you could buy a subscription for the season, kind of like you do on Netflix, and then that grants you access to their 4 or 5, whether it's performances live with no audience, or you know, maybe they make accessible 15 of their archival videos. So I mean, that's kind of where I think might happen. But we'll see. Yeah, the Nutcracker, unfortunately, is one of those ones. I know a lot of companies are holding off on their spring. The spring is long enough away that they're like, maybe we, but you know, the Nutcracker happens in December. And so I think a lot of companies just said, we're going to make the call. So, which is sad, because the Nutcracker is usually the biggest moneymaker for any ballet company.
And I'm sorry I was late coming in. I just have a question about Balanchine, which you might have addressed before. When did he come to the United States and things like that?
Yeah, early 1900s. So
Okay.
Christian brought him over. I have it on my other PowerPoints. I'm gonna say like loosely somewhere around like I think it was either just pre-World War I or just post-World War I. Probably just post-World War I, because World War I was really what caused the Ballet Russe to fold. So Sergei Diaghilev, who was a producer and sole director of the company, when he died, the company was left directorless. And then as kind of some of the people in the organization were fighting to see who would become the director, World War I hit. And that, of course, ended anything going on in Europe. And so I would say it'd probably be either during or just post-World War I.
Okay.
Yeah, that he was brought
Thank
up. Yeah.
I have a question. You said he done some movies. Do you know any of the titles off the top of your head?
Oh, I don't. You know, that's a great question. I wish I did. I know, I'm trying to think here. I used, off the top of my head, the 2 Broadway ones. It's not Pajama Game. That was done by Bob Fosse, who we're going to talk about next week. That's a great question. I will look it up and I will come back with that answer. I can tell you one other ballet choreographer who choreographed a very famous movie was Leonid Niside, who choreographed for the movie The Red Shoes. Yeah, but Balanchine, he did do, I think, 1 or 2 films. I will look that up for you and I'll get back. Yeah. I had a couple other questions here in the chat room, it looks like. We got the one, when did George Balanchine come to New York? Number 2 says, what injuries occurred during the early times of ballet, ? And with athletic ballet today? That's a great question. So what injuries occurred in early ballet, so the early Romantic period and classical period, there weren't many. Now, the reason being is that, you know, the point shoe was fairly new in the Romantic era, and that's when the ballet shoe was, or the point shoe was really developed. And so the idea, right, that's why you had those long flowing gowns. So that way, when the dancer went up on their toes, at that point they were called toe shoes, and they did what's called a bourrée, which is where they kind of quickly move their feet across. Those long gowns were meant to hide their feet, so that way it looked like they were floating across the stage. In the early part of the point shoe, which would have been the Romantic period, you did see a lot of ankle injuries, obviously, a lot of toe injuries, specifically like the toenails, because the way that the shoe was constructed, that if dancers didn't cut their toenails short enough, then anybody who's had a child who's done ballet in point shoe, it can bruise the tissue under the nail, and then the nail falls off. Of course, it's not a big deal today with antibiotics and, you know, Neosporin and all these things, but think, you know, early 1800s, that's a big deal, right? Any cut or any bruise. So, you know, really we started to see massive injuries in ballet, you know, really start to come about the time that the body structure or the desire of what the ballerina looked like. And that's because ballet dancers were quite literally starving themselves to get that thin. And so in that case, right, if your body doesn't have enough calories in it, it's going to start, and this is just pure physiology, it's going to start eating its own muscle as a way to generate energy. And so that's when we really started to see injuries rise in ballet, because dancers' bones were becoming very brittle because the body was just consuming itself to keep up with, you know, to keep the caloric need of it. That being said, the point shoe continued to develop today, where a lot of scientists, and there's two really big science organizations in dance who've done research on that, and they say the point shoe today is probably the most technologically advanced and perhaps has peaked at its technological advance as a point shoe in terms of how to protect the dancer's foot, how to protect their ankle, that sort of thing. I am by no means an expert, but you can certainly, you know, YouTube or Google how a point shoe is made. And there's some really cool videos, particularly out of Freed's in London, where they take you through the process. And that's one of the few industries where zero computers make it. It's all still, all the shoes are handmade because of the way they have to be constructed. So, I mean, they might use, you know, large saws or things like that, or large stitchers. You know, they're not using a little hand sewing machine like we would use at home. You know, they have industrial size, but it's all still done by hand. So it's one of the few industries that machines aren't doing the work, that people are, you know, a cobbler essentially is still doing the work. With athletic ballet today, the injuries you see, that's a great question. So you're seeing less injuries in terms of broken bones because of brittleness. The video you just watched, I think, is a good example of what also came along. And like I said, this was not balancing. It was a Russian ballet dancer. I can't remember her name right now, who's really accredited with kind of this high leg extension. Because up until that point, it was seen as sort of not couth, you know, that a woman would expose that much of her leg. But of course, I wish I could remember her name. It's escaping right now, but started that trend. The injuries you now see really, for example, would be like in that dancer, you know, obviously some sort of muscle tear or rupture because they're pushing their body to such extreme limits. Ankle injuries are still very prevalent in the dance world, particularly ballet, and knee injuries. And those come from, in ballet particularly, what's called the turnout, right? So you have, so if I'll show you with my hands, right? So most people stand in parallel. Well, in ballet, you stand in turnout. And of course, over the ages, originally in Louis XIV's era, turnout was about like this. And now we get to what we call a 180 degree turnout. The reason you see a lot of ankle and knee injuries is a lot of dancers will, if they're not properly trained, again, looking at the physiology of the body, the thing that's great about the body is that it's a mirror image of itself, both right and left and up and down. So your wrist is what's called a modified hinge joint, and so is your ankle. Your elbow is called a modified hinge joint, and so is your ankle. Your shoulders are called a ball and socket joint, and so your hips. And so I'll use my hands for an example. So your ankle, which I'm going to use my hand because they're the same kind of joint, is what's called a modified hinge joint. So a hinge joint is supposed to be like a hinge that moves forward and back. However, it's modified because of the number of bones in that area that it can also move more than just forward and back. So a lot of dancers, right? So when we talk about turnout in ballet, it should start in the hip, in the shoulder, or the shoulder, in the hip, in the ball and socket joint. A lot of dancers, though, if they're not properly trained, will try to then, if I show you this angle, will try to create that turnout with their ankle as well as their knee, right? So again, your elbow's a modified hinge joint, which is supposed to go, but as we both know, it can actually kind of go around in a circle. And so the problem with that is that if you land wrong, that your knees would fold in or your ankle is going to roll over. And so that's where, with the increasing demand of dancers today, even if they're super muscular, if the bones are not aligned correctly, then you can see a lot of what we call meniscal tears. They'll rupture ACLs, things like that. So that's a great question. sorry, that was a long history of, of the human body in ballet, but that kind of is how we get to today. Any other questions before we jump onto the next choreographer?
I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I'm Al. It seems like almost every era and almost every art form is dominated to some degree by conventions. And then along comes somebody who decides to break those conventions and do something else.
Yep.
Sometimes it's caused by social movements. Sometimes I guess it's caused just by creative artistry. Do you want to comment on what you are seeing in the history of dance here with BALANCHINE or anyone else?
Yeah, actually, so your question leads really well into our next person. Second, so Arthur Mitchell. So Arthur Mitchell I'll get to, but he's the first premier Black ballet dancer in the United States. And then he's also the founder of Dance Theater of Harlem. So to your point, as we talk about him, his spurring to leave City Ballet and start his own ballet company was the assassination of Martin Luther King. So that would be one of those, right, sort of moments in cultural history. So when I talk about dance history with my students, I always say art exists, and particularly in our case, dance, for 4 reasons. 1, self-gratification, and that self can be either like, worship with God or worship, but singing in the shower, anything like that, right? You're creating just for your own pleasure. Number 1 is to reflect culture, right? So you think of like the Greek vases, right? That, what they were trying to do is capture a moment in time in art. And so, art can exist to reflect culture. It can exist to preserve culture, right? And so we're trying to really make sure that this will last on forever, a la, a bronze statue, right? I mean, not that or granite, right? Those 2 things are going to stand the test of time. And then 3, change culture. And it doesn't always have to be only of those, right? So an artist could try to reflect culture in a manner to try and then change it, or vice versa, right? In trying to change culture, maybe they preserve it because people look back and go, hey, look at that. That was a flash moment in time. A really easy example of that would be the propaganda posters of the Nazis during the World War II era, right? They were trying to change the mindset of the German people. And in doing so, they actually preserved, for history's sake, right? We can go back and look at those and be like, oh, that's what was going on in that time. So with that question, I think it can be sometimes both, or and them. So that you might have somebody who is seeing a cultural social trend and says, you know what, I really want to speak to this, and therefore they become a game changer or a catalyst. I think sometimes, like you said, there are just artists who are just kind of brilliant. And I always say there's this fine line between brilliance and insanity. And there are a few artists like that who have just kind of teetered on that line and maybe tripped over one way or another every now and again. An example of that, of course, would be like Van Gogh, right? I mean, someone who was really ahead of his time, kind of teetered on it. The fact that he would cut his ear off and send it to his, wife or something like that. Pablo Picasso would be another one, right? Someone who really, not so much a culture influence on him as someone who is really just trying to find something new. And of course he develops, cubism, as it were. So I think the answer could be like sometimes artistic brilliance, sometimes, cultural technology shift. I mean, we're not going to talk about him today, but Alvin Nicolai would be a great example. As a choreographer, Alvin Nicolai, brilliant choreographer, brilliant artist, but really what allowed him to step into his brilliance was the advancement in clothing technology. So Lycra came around, so costumes could be, fabric could be stretched and pulled, advancement in lighting, and then advancement in technology. So he was able to actually, in the old days, I mean, you guys probably remember, like if you wanted to combine 2 pieces of music, you had to like cut the clip, cut the tape and then tape the 2 ends together. And then now you had, Nicolai started to come around, started to hit his stride when computers were just starting. And so he was able to play around with electronic music. So I think it could be both. But sometimes it could be only culture, and maybe that person isn't necessarily artistically brilliant, but they just happen to like be the voice that spoke at the right time that you know, that suddenly brought them up to fruition.
One quick question again, considering my age and my body conditions, at what age generally do the people of ballet retire or are forced out because of body changes, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So ballet is a little bit younger than the other dance forms. Modern's a little more forgiving. Postmodern is very forgiving because postmodern dance, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you know, can include everything from just walking and sitting. So we can all do that at any time. But sort of what we traditionally think of as dance, going to a concert and things like that, and particularly ballet dancers, most ballet dancers are fully retired so men can go a little bit longer only because there's less of them. So they can go about 32, 35. Women, usually by the time you hit 30, you're done. Yeah, which is really hard to think about, because you think of a young ballet dancer who works their way to get into a company. They'll start at the age of 8. By the time they're 12, they'll be in, let's say, the School of American Ballet. And then by the time that they're 16 or 18, they'll be in the core of the second company. And by the time they're in their like early 20s, they might be in the core of the main company. And if they finally hit their prima status, or even not even prima, but like one of the lead dancers, they're going to be like maybe 27. So that gives them like 3 to 4 years of like fame. And then that's it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great questions. Anything else? All right. Well, that's actually, I said, that's a great transition into our next choreographer, who is, I'm going to scroll down here real quick and jump on. There he is from current slide. Let's see here if I can, there we go. Arthur Mitchell. So Arthur Mitchell was born in Harlem, 1934. And he first joins ballet in Jerome Robbins. I don't talk a whole lot about Jerome Robbins, but he's pretty, when I teach dance history, I do, in Jerome Robbins' ballad. It's not in here. He actually makes his, where he really makes his splash is in Puck in Jerome Robbins. It's either Jerome Robbins or George Balanchine's Midsummer Night's Dream. And that's his fame. So Arthur Mitchell is not the first, actually, my apologies, prima dancer in an American ballet company. That belongs to another gentleman, and his name is escaping me. But that gentleman left for Europe in hopes of making more money, and sadly that his career fizzled out. And so we all remember Arthur Mitchell really as sort of the first notable and well-known lead Black dancer, right, in like the major ballet company in the United States. He leaves City Ballet for 2 reasons. One, so Martin Luther King is assassinated, and Arthur Mitchell is beginning to struggle as a young Black man to say, I have this great opportunity. How come there aren't other opportunities for young Black dancers? So he and a guy named Carl Shook open up a ballet school in Harlem. And there's actually a wonderful documentary that he talks about all of this. And one of the many things that he did is that they took away the required dress for ballet. So if you know anything, right, girls wear tights and leotards, and guys have to wear black tights and white leotards and stuff. And Arthur Mitchell at first just wants to get kids in the dance studio. So he does away with the standard ballet requirement for class and allows them to wear shorts and t-shirts and socks and things like that. And of course, as the school continues to grow, then he starts to implement more and more of sort of the classical ballet, dress code. All that being said, eventually he develops both the school and the company, the Dance Theater of Harlem, which is the only, or was the first, ballet company solely for African Americans. And the reason he wanted to do this is 2 things. Number one, like he said, he was looking at Harlem at the time. So you think of like 1970s, Harlem wasn't exactly a great part of New York. And so he wanted to give back to his community and kind of try to bring it out of the state it was in. Number 2, while there were other Black ballerinas as well, in a few of them in the United States and in Europe, none of them had prima status. None of them ever got to play the lead in any of the ballets. So they might have been the second highest ballet dancer in the company, but none of them got to play, you know, Clara in the, you know, or Mother Ginger. None of them got to play the White Swan in Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. You know, and so Arthur Mitchell said, you know what, we need to change that. The other reason is there was a predominant theory amongst the ballet world at that time that Black dancers couldn't do ballet anyways because of their body type. So he said, you know what, we're going to change that. Obviously I did, so let's see what we can do. The history of dance theory of Harlem is just kind of what those bullet points are. So it has its first performance in 1971. It folds in 1990. And then he travels to London and signs an agreement with the Royal Ballet Company, and then it reopens in 1991. And the reason it folded was just financial hardship. So, you know, a lot of ballet companies did this and a lot of dance companies did this. Let's see the next slide here. There we go. Click on it. There we go. It actually, that second bullet point here, it says, due to the downturn in the economy again, post 9/11, they folded again. However, they learned their lesson. And I'll say this, this one thing I appreciate about Dance Theater of Harlem, amongst many things, they learned from their history. And so what they did is they actually only folded the company, but they kept the school open, and they made the company dancers the teachers in the school, right? So the company dancers could still keep making money, still keep teaching dance, and still keep training for when it reopened, and it reopened 6 weeks later. They, along with other companies, obviously have been used by the State Department to travel. They were actually the first dance company to perform in South Africa on behalf of the United States, just post-apartheid. And like I said, DTH is, and its school continue to operate this day, and everybody accolades and honors. They really are, I think today they've opened it up so it might be a slightly more diversified company, but it is still predominantly a ballet company for African Americans. And the reason that is that because most dance companies in the United States, while they are diversified, are predominantly, and I'm going to say like I'm going to throw this number and say like 70 to 80% white, and maybe like 30 to 40% Black. And that's probably me being very generous. It's probably more like on the realm of like 90% white and 10% Black. And so Dance Theater of Harlem really holds that sort of, that pillar to say, hey, look, because jobs are so small in the ballet world, specifically for Black dancers, we're gonna make sure that we're there and holding this pillar. There's a couple of the companies in the United States who have joined them. Alonzo King's Lines Ballet is one of them. Again, I don't think it's a solely Black dancer company. I believe that there are a few, you know, whether it's, you know, white or, you know, from Asian descent dancers, but predominantly Black. Miami City Ballet, not predominantly Black, but mostly dancers who have fled Cuba. So people don't realize that Cuba has a fantastic national ballet company. A lot of those dancers, of course, suffer under communism still. And so they have fled to, like most Cubans, to Miami. Miami City Ballet, though, is now predominantly made up of prime and premier dancers from the Cuban National Ballet. So minus those three, though, those are really the predominant ones. Let's see here. Oh, and then the other reason, like I said, that he started Dance Theater of Harlem was to break the myth that Black dancers can't do ballet. And that had to do with a lot of types, you know, in terms of like bone structure. And, you know, some dancers said, well, their muscles are just too tight, you know, they don't have the right type, all these sort of things. And so that's why Arthur Mitchell really set out to say, you know what, we're going to prove everybody wrong. And he did. And so, you know, to the gentleman's question earlier, I would say he was one who, he himself did not choreograph a ton of ballets, but he definitely, you know, was a change agent by looking at the current situation and saying, all right, how can I make this different? And so, yeah, Arthur Mitchell's one of them. Here's a little video we'll watch just of him talking about that myth. This is Arthur Mitchell. Sadly, Arthur Mitchell passed away, actually, I think not very long ago, like 2 or 3 years ago. So he's been around for a while. You'll forgive me, I'm gonna press play and I'm gonna fast forward it to the 3-minute mark, because the first part's just the opening interview of your sort of typical chit chat and things like that. Let's see if I can find my mouse.
The new dance group was a modern school.
Okay.
And that's where I danced with Donnie McHale, the Tanya Newman, Sophie Maslow, Bill,
Jump ahead here.
called Whale, W-A-I-L. And oh, it was just so intense. And that's where Lincoln Kirstein saw me and offered me a scholarship to the School of American Ballet. And
But while in high school,
yeah, this
when
is
the
my
teachers, right, when the teachers were saying,
yeah, I can say ballet. No.
now also, again, in terms of them encouraging you to go into ballet, it wasn't like that was a career maker, you know?
No,
I mean,
and it was also at that time the fallacy was that blacks couldn't do classical ballet. Now we're talking about the early 50s now.
Now, explain that a little bit more.
Okay. Well, someone said there was a fallacy that black people could not do classical ballet because they had big butts and they had flat feet and the arches and all like that. And so Mr. Shook was one of the few teachers that were teaching black dancers or black kids to dance ballet. And he was at Catherine Dunham's. So that's how Mary told me to go to Catherine Dunham's. You see, it's a small world because I was at the modern dance group with Donnie McHale and the new dance group.
And okay, so this belief that blacks physically and intellectually and educationally and socially and every other way could not do classical ballet.
And this is what I'd heard. And
because it was a European art form.
Exactly right. Even today, my dancers, these young, they don't know how to tip. You see, when you're in a gang and you had your debs, they had to tip. I mean, it's a kind of walk. See, the only place you're going to see it is at Dance Theater of Harlem. That's why my girls, they know how to tip. Lola Falana. That's why she was the highest paid artist in Las Vegas. She said tits and ass, and she tipped. You see, and but you know what? You said.
My apologies. I forgot that that he said that at the end. So my apologies for that. But anyway, so Arthur Duncan, Dance Theater of Harlem. I'm going to stop sharing again real quick, and we'll stop for questions that people may have before we jump styles, and we're going to go into modern dance after this. Obviously, these are just a few people. So the hard part about picking people who changed the face of ballet, one who I talk about all the time in dance history, of course, and you guys would know well, is Mikhail Baryshnikov. Mikhail Baryshnikov really actually established a new standard for what was expected of male ballet dancers and what they could do. So much so that in the dance world, we actually still have a saying, we'll see a male dancer and we'll go, wow, that guy was amazing, but he's no Baryshnikov. And so there's a lot of people, Jerome Robbins would be another one. Jerome Robbins was the first choreographer to combine jazz and ballet. So, but these are just two that really, really started to shift the focus of ballet in the United States.
Is there the use of dance in the sporting world at all?
Say that again. Is the use of dance?
The use of dance in sporting world. Are any of the athletes trained dance techniques which strengthen their agility in sports for that?
It's funny you say that. There's two funny stories. One, the answer is yes, but so there are actually several NFL football players who take ballet class.
Okay.
Especially during the off season, right? As a way to maintain flexibility, agility, and things like that. The funny thing is that studies have proven if athletes took dance, particularly ballet and improvisation, which is kind of a technique of modern, they could improve whatever it is their athletic game is by up to 30 or 40%. So wherever they're at, they could probably improve that by 30 or 40%. The funny thing is there's such a stereotype, particularly of athletic men taking dance, that most men don't do it. And that goes back to just a sort of a funny story that I remember reading one time. Wilt Chamberlain, I think everybody, you know, if you're a big fan of basketball, you know Wilt Chamberlain, you know, the winningest basketball player in the history of basketball, things like that. Long story short, he really struggled with his free throw shot. He was like Shaquille O'Neal, he was terrible. And actually the person who helped Wilt Chamberlain helped Shaquille O'Neal. And the first thing he did with Wilt Chamberlain is he said, listen, you know, rather than shoot the basket like this, I want you to shoot it underhand. And what do we all call that shot? We call it, right? It's called the granny shot, right? As if like it's not a man's way to shoot a basketball. Well, the funny thing is Wilt Chamberlain did it for one season. He did it for one season. He shot his free throws and he improved. He was like a 21% free throw shooter, and he improved to like an 83% free throw shooter. I mean, a drastic change. Shaquille O'Neal tried it in practice and he improved his free throw shot. But they got so much guff from all the other players about shooting like a woman that they stopped doing it. Even though it was proof to like not only like enhance their game, but help their team win. And so I think that's the funny thing about dance is that you have kind of that same thing. It's statistically proven if athletes were to take certain kinds of dance that would help their athletic game, they would go beyond whatever plateau they're at. But particularly men, very few of them do it because of this, the stereotype or the guff that they would get. So yeah.
But there are many moves in a lot of sports that are very graceful, and it's like a dance.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And dancers particularly rely on something called muscle memory, right? Mm-hmm. And so in training that, you would absolutely train your ability in that athletic, or it would certainly carry over then to whatever athletic training you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Not so much a question, just a comment. When I think of black ballet, I think of Elvin Ailey.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's out of Houston, or he was.
Yeah, he will be, so we have Merce Cunningham, we're going to talk about next, and Elvin Ailey is right after that. Exactly. Yep. He is definitely a game changer for sure. So I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to talk about him.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yes. How many opportunities are there for young folks, either commercial or in the current school systems?
Oh, that's a great question. Unfortunately in school systems, it's getting smaller and smaller. So we all know that in public schools particularly, if something's got to be cut, it's the arts. That's always the first thing that's cut. Now, in the artistic world, the hierarchy pretty much runs like this. You've got music at the top, you've got visual art either at the top with it or just below it, then you've got theater, and then you've got dance at the bottom. Choral I include in music, right? So both vocal and instrumental. And I apologize for any vocalists out there because yes, your voice is an instrument. I've heard that before. So long story short, if a school system has a dance program and they need to make cuts, that's the first program that's always cut, hands down. And we've seen that a lot. So over the last, I'm going to say 5 years, in the state of Michigan alone, we've seen the number of dance programs in public schools decline. I think at one point there were up to like 30 schools in Michigan, public schools, and now it's like 10 that have dance programs as a part of them. So in that case, a lot of the dance for young kids, they have to go to dance studios. So in Holland, right, we have Turning Point, we have Avalon, in Saugatuck, there's I think like Spotlight Dance. The problem with that, of course, is that those cost money. And so if you come from a low income home, then your chance of taking dance at a studio, unless the dance studio gives you a scholarship, is zero because, and so I'm actually a product of that example. So I didn't start dancing until I got to college because I lived in a very poor rural community. And my parents, dance first of all, dance wasn't a thing outside of like prom and like homecoming. And my parents couldn't afford it, even if it was, so everything I participated had to be through the public school because that was, your taxpayer money goes to that. And that was free, quote unquote, minus, if you had to buy shoes for basketball or something like that. So, you know, the sad part is there is a bit of a gap disparity right now for young people in dance, because a lot of it is tied to, you know, if your parents have additional income that they can put to send you to a studio to dance. That being said, I am proud Zeeland High School has a thriving dance program, and they're still thriving. So that's one that's nice. West Ottawa has kind of a small dance program. Most of the dance programs in public schools, to be honest, are actually in the Detroit area, so the Wayne County area. There's a lot, and there's actually even a few arts-specific high schools. In the commercial world, so in the ballet world, while the jobs are limited for Black dancers, in the commercial world, so like Las Vegas or LA or cruise ships or things like that, it's a much broader spectrum, and so there's a lot more opportunities, and that's why you see a lot of young Black dancers go that route versus go the ballet route, because the job opportunities are just that much more accessible. Did that answer the question?
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. One thing about it, at my age, you're limited to the Texas two-step.
Right. Absolutely. Which is, I think, you know, fun for me to see as a dancer that ballroom has seen a resurgence. Obviously, you know, Dancing with the Stars is like one of the biggest examples, but ballroom, you know, to your point, everything from the Foxtrot to the Lindy Hop to the Texas two-step, all of that is seeing a big resurgence in young people. So much so that Grand Rapids actually has a swing dance club that has a live swing band, and people who are in their like mid-20s and late 20s are going and learning how to do the Lindy Hop and the Charleston and, you know, all these steps that you guys remember, and that's how they're spending their evenings is at, you know, a dance hall. Is what it is. So it's been fun for me to watch that trajectory of social dance in the United States. Any other questions before we move to the modern dance realm? All right, well, I will share my screen again, and we're gonna jump on this one, and I'm gonna scroll down here and click, and from current slide, there we go. So there's a lot of people I could talk about in modern dance who really changed the face of dance in America. Obviously, the mother of American modern dance is Adora Duncan. The name that rings true with most people, Martha Graham. I could certainly talk about her all day long, but those are names that most people know, and so that's why I left them out. Doesn't mean they didn't. I mean, Martha herself physically and, you know, through the number of people who went through her school changed the face of dance. I mean, pretty much anybody in modern dance in America who was a huge choreographer in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s came through Martha Graham's school and or company, including Madonna. So, you know, she definitely, but Merce Cunningham is one of those people that I think, unless you know a lot about postmodern dance, wouldn't know his name or know how he really changed, you know, modern dance and dance in the United States. So Cunningham, it was part of what's called the postmodern movement. And so there's two really fascinating periods in dance history, and I love them because they both mirror each other. So the first one happens in the late, it's like the tail end of the 1800s, early 1900s, right? Specifically like 1907 through like 1913. And if you know anything about Paris, France at the time, there's something going on called the Bohemian Revolution. Right? And so you have sort of the upper social class of Paris, the very wealthy, and then you have all of these young artists and kind of people who are just kind of, you know, trying to make a living. And so as a part of the Bohemian Revolution, you have people like Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, Rene Magritte, Václav Nijinsky, right? You know, pretty much anybody who was anybody in the art world. They weren't anybody at that point, but they were the young artists trying to find a voice for themselves. Long story short, you know, it kind of culminates with Václav Nijinsky's Rite of Spring, Stravinsky's score, right? And that was a time that changed the face of dance, because it was one of the few times that actually dance caused a riot. So there was a riot that lasted 3 days after the Rite of Spring opened, because of just how controversial it was, based on the expectation of the wealthy class going, and then what the young artists created. Fast forward literally not quite a century to the 1960s, and you have East Village and Greenwich Village, New York. And so you have something again called the postmodern movement, where you have a bunch of these young artists kind of just struggling to survive and sell works and things like that. And they start thinking, here's where the dance world is, here's where the music world is, here's where the art world is. We don't want to do what everybody else is doing. Let's shake it up. How do we make our own voice? And so I named 3 people here. Merce Cunningham, right, for dance, right, really says, how can I change the way that dance is done? John Cage, for any musicians out there, that name should sound familiar, right? And he starts to become famous with what's called his prepared piano pieces. Specifically, I think it's prepared number 7, where he walks out and bashes the piano with a baseball bat for like 7 minutes or something. John Jaspers, right, who's a visual artist, and then Robert Rauschenberg. And Robert Rauschenberg, you probably remember from his very famous Prince series, right? So the Marilyn Monroe Prince and the Campbell Soup Prince and all these sort of things. Long story short, Merce Cunningham is hanging out with these people, and they all start to collaborate together. And so John Cage starts writing music for Merce Cunningham's dance pieces. Robert Rauschenberg starts creating sets or canvases and things like that. And out of this starts to blossom later what's called the postmodern movement. So Merce Cunningham is really the grandfather of the postmodern movement. And so in that then, like Balanchine, Cunningham says, how do I create something unique now that can be tied to me and tied to where we're at? And so he creates something called chance dance. And so one of the first things, as you know, in dance, whenever you go see it, is you want everything to go exactly the same way every night, or as close to it as possible, right? Because the idea is the audience is paying, and they should come to Wednesday night show, and it should look almost exactly like Thursday night show with maybe a little bit of difference, but the idea is to keep every show the same so every audience has the same experience. Whereas Cunningham says, well, wait a second, if I want to make something different, let's start with the foundation of performance. And so I want chance to be the #1 thing in all of my performances. And so really he creates this theory and technique called chance dance, which is the desire of unpredictability in any given performance. So actually the idea that an audience could come to a show twice and it will never look the same. And so he creates this theory around three ways. #1 is called the treatment of stage and space. So in dance and in theater, we have places on the stage that are usually given more weight than another, right? So if somebody is standing all the way what's called downstage, as close to the audience as possible, that's what we call a power stage, right? The actor, dancer is super close to the audience, and so the audience feels more connected to the dancer or actor. And of course, the further they go away or upstage, then the more removed. Same thing, if a dancer is facing the audience, they can see their face, and so the audience feels connected. If the dancer or the actor faces their back to the audience, they feel more removed. Cunningham says, you know what, I'm going to let that all go, and I'm going to say that every space on the stage and every facing is equal. So I'm not going to worry about where an audience is when I create. I'm only going to just be interested on facing, and that's it. #2 is that he intentionally creates unpredictability in his pieces. So there's a couple ways he does this. We're going to watch a small clip of a piece called Rainforest, which was actually created, and the set was created by Robert Rauschenberg, as were the costumes. And the set are these silver helium balloons that as the piece goes on and the helium balloons warm up, they start to fall down and deflate. And then as the dancers are moving, they get kicked and things like that. Well, you can never predict when they're going to start to fall and when they're not going to, all that kind of stuff. And so that's that kind of experience. Another way he did this, when the iPod first came out, Apple launched as one of their launches for the iPod. Merce Cunningham worked with them, and he put an iPod in every single seat of the theater. And so the audience could choose. There were 6 songs, and there were headphones, and the audience could choose their song, and there was a red light on the stage, and the moment the red light turned on, you hit play. And so you would listen through your headphones and watch the dance. If you took your headphones off, there would be no music. The dancers were dancing in silence. But again, right, the idea that you could come essentially to the show 6 times and experience it 6 different ways because you had six different songs to choose from. One of his most famous ways that he would do this is that he would create, rather than create a dance from beginning to end, he would create what are called events, right? So he'd create, you know, a small section of choreography that was 5 minutes long and call it event A or event 1. And then he'd create event 2, another section of 5 minutes choreography. And then 3, 4, 5, let's say 6 events. And then opening night, every night the show went up, he'd take a dice and he'd roll it 4 times. And whatever numbers came up, those were the events that you did, and that's the order you did it in. So audience on Monday night might see event 1 4 times through. Audience on Tuesday might see event 1, 4, and 3, depending on how the dice was rolled, right? And it was, again, a way to like make it unpredictable. That was, you know, another tool he would do is that, again, same thing, right? In dance, you know, a lot of times the choreographer will work with the composition, the composer, and they'll make sure the dance and the music link up, and then you'll make sure the costumes reflect the music and that the set. And Cunningham was renowned for having the music created separately. So he'd be creating the dance while having John Cage write something. You know, he had no idea. And then he'd have Robert Rauschenberg create some kind of set, and then he may have Robert do the costumes or a different costumer. And opening night was the first time all those were brought together. So opening night would be the first time the dancers wore the costume. It'd be the first time that they heard the music. It'd be the, you know, and who knows what's going to happen. And because it's the first time, then if you have 8 shows, every show is going to be different because the dancers are going to be getting used to it more and more and more. So this idea of chance dance, like I said, is really how he shifted. And in doing it, it opened the door for what is in modern dance is called the postmodern movement, a way of looking at dance differently than traditional, right? That, you know, it doesn't have to be consistent. You can get an audience to come even if they don't know. In fact, you might get more audiences. I mean, that was the thing. Cunningham exploded because audiences were like, oh my gosh, I could come to the show 3 times and see a different show every time. That's amazing. You know, and so he really opened that door. In his lifetime, as the director of the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, he choreographed over 150 dances and over 800 events. So remember, the events are just those little bits of snippets of choreography that he would use sometimes in concerts. He was one of the first choreographers to make dance for galleries. So he actually did several shows in the Museum of Metropolitan Art, and audiences, again, by chance, you could walk around, watch you could step into a room that you could decide to stay in that room for the whole 2 hours and watch whatever's going on, but you could walk from gallery to gallery and see different parts of the dance or different dances. He was also one of the first companies to embrace this kind of Zoom online format. So at the tail end of his life, he was in a wheelchair, but he would still teach company class vocally. And so he had what was called Mondays with Merce. So dancers from across the country, and this was back in the early 2010. You could register and sign in, and you could take class with Merce Cunningham's company, and then he'd answer questions at the end. Also one of the first choreographers to embrace technology for choreography. So there was a technology called Lifeforms that you could, I mean, I think you guys remember, I certainly remember. So you have to remember the old school computers where you had to, like MS-DOS, you had to type in the code, and then like the turtle or some animal would like hop 1 step, you know, across the screen. It was an early form. And so Cunningham, again, to try and create unpredictability, he would use technology with a stick figure, and he'd type in a bunch of codes and see what it would do and be like, and then he'd show his dancers, go do that, you know, and then the next thing he'd type in a bunch of codes, and then the stick figure would do something, you go, okay, do that, you know. And a lot of times, sometimes the dancers like, we can't do that. The stick figure just jumped 80 feet, you know. So he'd have to adapt, but he again, you know, advanced forward thinking and looking at that. One of the things about him, he was also forward thinking and changed the face of dance. So in modern dance, we call it the golden age. And it was one choreographer companies. So Merce Cunningham, you know, Martha Graham, Jose Limon, Alvin Ailey, Paul Taylor, right? These single choreographers choreographing all the works for their company. Well, when those people died, a la Martha Graham, Jose Limon, you know, usually there was some predecessor appointed in the will by that person to keep the company going. The problem with that is, of course, is that if it's not clear in the will or in the estate, then things can get messy. Lawyers can get involved. Cunningham, again, wanting unpredictability. Nobody knew this until he passed away. He had arranged that on the day of his death, the company had a 3-year global tour at all these events that he'd already pre-established ahead of time. And at the end of those 3 years, the company was done. No more. And so by golly, he passed away. And 1 month later, the company went on a 3-year global tour. It ended in 2000. Oh man, when was it? 2015, I think. But it ended at midnight in Paris, which was the same place he had his first professional gig as a choreographer. So it was a stunning event. But again, right, ever the person to be forward thinking. And so now there's the Merce Cunningham Dance Trust, where colleges or companies can email the trust and say, we would really like to do, let's say, any one of the pieces I mentioned here. And the trust will say, okay, we will send a representative. There's about 4 of them, to teach it to you. There's obviously a fee you have to pay, and then you can perform it for this amount of time, and then it has to go away. And so again, very forward thinking and changing again the way that dance is done and the way companies live on, to his predecessors. So here's a quick clip. We won't watch the whole thing just because we're starting to run out of time, of his work, Rainforest. So I apologize. I'm going to stop it short just because I want to make sure we get through Elvin Ailey. But obviously one of the things too with that is that he opened the door for postmodern dance, which is the idea, kind of like Balanchine. All previous people, Martha Graham, Jose Limon, right? All dances before that had a storyline, and so he, like Balanchine, but for the modern world, said, "Well, wait a second. Let's create dance. Not just even to music, but let's create dance to sound." And what happens then? So yeah, he really sort of changed the face in that direction. Questions on Cunningham or anything sort of in that area? No? All right, well, we'll quickly, just because my time's running short, we're going to jump ahead to the final person, who is, oops, sorry, my apologies. Let me do this here real quick. Thought I was sharing and I'm not. We're going to jump to Elvin Ailey. So share screen. Here we go. And we're going to scroll down. So the last person we're going to talk about today is Elvin Ailey. There we go. And like I said, like one of you said, one of the first people you think of when you think of a black dance company, and there's a very big reason why. Quick tutorial of his life, right? Born in Texas, moves to the Horton School. If you want to know more about Lester, I'm happy to chat about that at any point. Lester Horton dies, and Ailey steps forward and becomes the lead choreographer of Lester Horton's company. He then leaves again, comes to New York, starts learning from Graham, Humphrey, Limon, right, which are big names in modern dance at the time. Realizes, kind of like Arthur Mitchell, I love dance, I love what we're doing, but it's just not speaking to me as a black man in America. So he starts his own dance company and calls it the Elvin Ailey Dance Theater Company. And they have their first performance in 1958. There we go. Oops. Let me go back one here. In his lifetime, he creates over 70 works for for the ALE company. Of course, the most famous piece, if you've ever had the wonderful opportunity, Revelations, it closes the show almost every time you go see ALE, and there's a reason why. You know, aside from creating, again, the first modern dance company for Black dancers, he's known for carrying on the Lester Horton technique. So ALE dancers as a part of the company have to take the Horton technique every day. Again, I could go into what the importance of that with Lester Horton, but I want to save time just for a little bit of the video and questions. But he's also known for blending in jazz and ballet with modern, hence the reason a lot of times we think of ALE as a ballet company, because they have so many reflections of ballet, even though they're a modern company. But it's because ALE was very much about trying to blend all of these dance traditions together as a part of it. You know, the other thing is that I'll say this, is that, you know, really what he was trying to do is he was trying to create a company not just for Black dancers in modern dance. Now, the funny thing is modern dance companies, including Graham, were very diverse. So it wasn't that there was a lack of jobs, but he wanted a dance company that specifically spoke to, the traditions in the Black community. Revelations being an example of it, right? The experience, of, you know, going to a Black Southern Baptist church. And so that's really where he was able to make his mark and say, listen, you know, we're gonna add to the conversation already that's going on. The other thing I'll say this is that last bullet point at the bottom, Elvin Ailey, through his company, set the standard hands down for any other Black modern dance company in America. And there's many. There's Dayton Contemporary Dance Company, there's Philadelphia, there is Black Dance of Houston. All of these really, deeply rooted, Chicago's another one. Whether you like it or not, or whether those companies like it or not, when an audience goes to watch them, they're comparing their dancers, production, and everything to ALE. just hands down. Kind of like how in football, love them or hate them, the Patriots kept winning the Super Bowl. So every football season, people are like, is this team better than the Patriots? You know, it's kind of that way with Elvin Ailey's company. They have just set the standard for it. So I'm not going to show the video. I will actually share the slides with Kim. But this is on YouTube. You can certainly, you know, Google Revelations, Elvin Ailey. It's a beautiful piece that I recommend. If you haven't seen it, there's a couple full-length versions on YouTube. Just stunning, just absolutely stunning of a piece. It opens, this opening scene right here, which we would watch, opens with, you know, sort of Black Southern gospel music. Again, the idea of Ailey trying to speak into, giving some performance references to his tradition and history. So I realize I'm 1 minute over time, but I am happy to answer questions if people have questions about sort of anything I talked about today. Like I said, there's a lot of choreographers. Martha Graham, I left out. You know, obviously Isadora Duncan, the mother of American modern dance. I mean, you know, there's a lot of people, but like I said, I try to pick people that maybe you haven't heard of before. BALANCHINE, I think most people have heard of, but you know, you really can't talk about ballet in America without talking about BALANCHINE. So, great. Well, thank you all.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I highly
awesome.
love.
I think Marty's trying to say something. Hold on a second.
Hold
on, Marty, you're muted. Just a minute, honey.
Did I get her? No, I didn't.
I'm trying, but it's not working. Hold on a second.
Here.
All right, go ahead, Marty.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. I can't see. Oh, okay, I see that. Thank you so much for all of this information. You speak so easily in answering questions, and we really appreciate your presentation today, and look forward to more of the same next week. So thank you for all of you for coming, and thanks again, Matt. Maybe we can say thank you.
Thank you. And next week, just to give you a preface, we'll be talking, we'll be covering jazz, tap, and hip hop. So we'll be talking obviously about Sir Bob Fosse, Gregory Hines would be another one, Rennie Harris in the hip hop industry. So if those areas interest you, that's what we'll be talking about next week.
Thanks, that was awesome. Great to see you, Matt. Great to see you, Haspers. I'm gonna end the meeting and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Kim, can you stay on a minute?
I'll call you in a minute, Marty. Or actually, go ahead. That's fine. You can stay on. I think
This is
everybody else
fine.
is staying on. I'm having a really hard time with your sound. I'm not sure why.
Can you hear me?
Barely. I'm gonna sign out and then just sign back into hope.edu in a minute, okay?